Okay, good morning, girls. Today's grammar lesson is a continuation of sentence structure. We already had the very first part of it, which dealt with using coordinating conjunctions to join sentences. You remember the lesson using but or and to join sentences or different parts of a sentence. Now today we're still dealing with how to join sentences, but we're using, instead of coordinating conjunctions now, we're using these words: who, which, that. Now we came across who and which when we dealt with WH questions, that uh, when I told you that, or for that lesson, we were told these are WH words. But for today's lesson, they're under a different title, they are under a different heading. For the lesson sentence structure, or using them in terms of relative clauses, they're called relative pronouns. There are others, but this particular unit is dealing with only 3 of them. As you go further into the textbook, I think we're going to come across more. So which, who, that, for this lesson, in terms of relative clauses, are known as relative pronouns. Okay? Now, relative pronouns are used to introduce relative clauses. Now, we know that, before I go ahead, you're going to notice that lately we've been mentioning clauses and phrases a lot. Okay? So, the point I'm trying to make is that the word clause is not alien to you. By now, you should know what a clause is. Okay? When we talk about sentence structure, this title, I elaborated on this introduction in the last lesson. When we talk about sentence structure, we're basically talking about how we combine words or phrases or clauses to form good grammar, right? So, words, of course, we know what words are. We know that phrases are those group of words without a complete meaning, and they lack a subject verb combination. And now I told you that clauses are those group of words that have subject verb combination, which may or may not be uh, uh, meaningful on their own. So I can have a dependent clause which doesn't have a complete meaning on its own, and I can have an independent clause which on its own has a full meaning. But either way, a clause must have that subject verb combination, and the verb must be a finite verb. Okay? Now, a relative clause, like we mentioned, it was unit 6 of our Cambridge checkpoint. Yeah, we came across this. A relative clause is a subordinate clause, and a subordinate clause is just another name for a dependent clause, a clause that cannot stand alone. Okay, so for these kinds of dependent clauses called relative, there are other kinds of dependent clauses, but we're dealing with only one type today. For this kind of dependent clauses, known as relative clauses, we use relative pronouns to introduce them in a sentence, to begin them in a sentence. And we have 3 examples of the relative pronouns here, okay? Now, let's go into the rules and see how they're used. Now, rule 1 simply says that when we join 2 sentences, we can turn one into a main clause and the other into a subordinate clause. Each clause has a subject and a finite verb. Just like I just said it a few seconds ago, that a clause must have, whether it's a dependent or an independent clause, it must contain a finite verb. Okay? Main clause is the same as independent, the one that can stand alone, while the subordinate clause is the dependent clause, the one that cannot stand alone. It leans on the main clause to bring out its meaning. In other words, the main clause helps to bring out its meaning. On its own, it cannot have a full meaning. Okay? And a relative clause is an example of a subordinate clause. A relative clause cannot stand alone. Okay? When you combine 2 sentences, making one the main clause and the relative clause leans on the main clause to be meaningful. Now let's see an example of what they mean by combining 2 sentences with a relative pronoun, whereby you make one a relative clause, which is the subordinate clause, and you make one the main clause. Let's see. Now we have this example here which says Han is an artist. This is one clause. a dependent clause because it can stand alone. And of course, it has a finite verb, is. Okay? One subject, one finite verb. Now, let's see the next sentence. He has won many prizes. He is our subject, has won is our finite verb. Okay, here we have a verb phrase. He has won many prizes. So our finite verb, you see that one subject, finite verb, so another clause. Now we have two independent clauses. Now we want to join them because the rule says that when we join two sentences, we can turn one into a main and turn the other into a subordinate. So let's see how we can combine these two sentences, making one a main clause and the other a subordinate. Now, Han is an artist, which is the first one. We see that this has a full meaning on its own, which tells us that this is our main clause. I told you, the main clause is the independent one, right? See, on its own, it has full meaning. It doesn't need any other word or any other sentence to help bring out its meaning. So the main clause here is this one. Han is an artist who has won many prizes. Now, you see that I told you that we introduce or we begin relative clauses with relative pronouns, right? So we picked this one, who, one of our relative clauses, and we put it here. So we have who has won many prizes. Now let's see, you see here, this is where the sentence is demarcated. Now you see that from here we have who has won many prizes. If I just come to you and I just say who has won many prizes, not as a question now, because of course this can be a question beginning with the WH word, but as a statement. If I come to you and I make a statement, who has won many prizes, you're going to realize that this is incomplete. It doesn't make any full meaning. You're going to say, who has won many prizes what? I don't get what you're saying. So this is why this cannot stand alone. Is leaning on this main clause to be meaningful. Now this here, which cannot stand alone, is a subordinate clause. And because we're beginning it with a relative pronoun, who, it is a relative clause. Okay, so you see here it says main clause, here it says subordinate clause. And there's another important thing for you to note. Just in case I give you in the exam, I'll give you two sentences and I ask you to combine both using the relative clause. This is what you do. You see that here, the main clause, they just repeated exactly the first sentence the way it is. And in the second sentence, something changed. They removed they removed he and changed it with the relative pronoun who. Okay, and then you remove this full stop, of course, and the sentence continues. Han is an artist who has won many prizes. All right, for this main clause, you see this is the subject of the main clause, this is the finite verb of the main clause. For the relative clause or the subordinate clause, the same thing. This is the subject of the relative clause, and this is the finite verb of the relative clause. I told you it's a verb phrase together. Okay, so now let's go into rule 2.